I am Maya, 35 years old, and I just watched my husband of 10 years leave me shivering on a freezing New York sidewalk, so his 20-something secretary could take my seat on a private jet to Las Vegas. As his luxury sedan splashed ice slush across my coat, he rolled down the window and told me to catch a cab and find a cheap motel. I just stood there wiping the sleet from my eyes and smiled. Because what Terrell did not know was that the prestigious architecture gala he was rushing to attend was hosted by my father, and I owned the very building his firm was sitting in. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who they are dealing with. The December rain cut through my trench coat like shattered glass, but the cold could not compete with the absolute ice settling in my chest. For 10 long years, I had been the invisible spine of Terrell's architecture firm. When we first met, he was a struggling intern sharing a cramped, drafty studio in Brooklyn. I was eating cheap instant noodles and drowning under the crushing weight of his student debt. I saw his potential, or at least the potential I wanted to see. I poured my own savings into his dreams. I used funds I had quietly acquired from my family to cover his rent, buy his drafting software, and eventually launch his entire business. I drafted the actual blueprints he proudly took credit for during his investor meetings. I balanced the corporate books late at night when his reckless spending threatened to put us in the red. I played the role of the supportive, unassuming plain wife perfectly. I did this because I wanted a man to love me for me, not for the billionaire real estate dynasty I came from. My family, the Caldwells, practically built half the commercial properties on the West Coast. But I had spent my entire adult life keeping a deliberate distance between my private identity and the Caldwell corporate machine. Richard Caldwell was known publicly as Richard Caldwell, chairman of Caldwell Enterprises. I was never featured in company profiles, society pages, or public family photographs. After my mother's death, my father respected my decision to build a private life in New York, and Terrell never met him face to face. I kept my Caldwell surname because it belonged to me, but Terrell assumed it was simply a common family name with no connection to the billionaire developer he idolized from afar. His arrogance did the rest. He never once imagined that the quiet wife balancing his books could belong to the family whose approval he spent years chasing. I wanted a marriage built on a genuine partnership, not a financial transaction. I wanted to build an empire together. I never realized I was just building his ego. As his company grew fueled completely by my unseen capital and my architectural designs, Terrell changed. The humble man I fell in love with morphed into an arrogant, status-obsessed narcissist. When his firm started landing million-dollar commercial projects, the gratitude he used to show me completely vanished. Instead of thanking me, he began to resent my presence. He started complaining that my dark brown skin and natural hair were not stylish enough for the elite, predominantly white social circles he was desperately trying to infiltrate. He wanted a trophy wife, someone who looked the part of a superficial socialite. His disrespect was constantly validated by his sister Chloe and her husband Julian. Julian is a white man who comes from a family of minor local politicians, and he never missed a chance to make snide, racially coded comments about my background. During family dinners, Julian would sip his expensive wine and tell me I should stay in the kitchen where I belonged, making jokes that I looked like a charity case Terrell had picked up off the street. He assumed I was just some uneducated woman who had gotten lucky by marrying an upcoming architect. Terrell never once defended me against Julian's racism or Chloe's blatant hostility. He just laughed along, eager to fit into their shallow world, telling me I was being too sensitive and needed to learn how to take a joke. All of this culminated tonight. Tonight was supposed to be a triumph. We were supposed to fly to Las Vegas for the National Developers Gala, the most important event in the real estate industry. But right outside the private departure lounge, Terrell stopped the car. He looked me dead in the eye and told me to get out. He said there was only one seat left on the chartered plane, and Brittany needed it more because she was the fresh young face of his company. Brittany is his blonde, blue-eyed secretary. She has been parading around the office for 6 months acting like she owned the place. I had suspected they were having an affair for a long time. There were late-night meetings that made no sense, sudden extravagant expenses on the company card, and the cloying scent of a cheap floral perfume lingering on his suit jackets. But tonight, standing in the sleet, the reality of his betrayal was no longer just a quiet suspicion. It was a calculated, deliberate, public humiliation. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling me from the bitter memories. My fingers were stiff and numb from the freezing rain as I unlocked the screen. It was a text message from Terrell. "Go find a cheap motel for the night and stay out of my way. Do not call me. I am trying to secure major funding this weekend, and you looking like a drowned rat will only ruin my image. Brittany is helping me prep the presentation. Do not embarrass me." I stared at the screen, letting the icy water run down my face. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for women who had no options, and I had a universe of options at my fingertips. I had spent a decade dimming my own brilliant light just so Terrell could feel like the sun. I had worn modest clothes, driven an old, unreliable car, and let him play the role of the self-made genius while I quietly pulled every single string behind the curtain. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. He believed I was a helpless, dependent woman who would just crawl back to our apartment and wait for him to return from his romantic getaway. The sleet continued to fall, turning the New York pavement slick and treacherous. Cars rushed past, their headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a high-priority push notification from the secure banking application tied to our joint corporate account. My jaw tightened as I read the alert. Terrell had just authorized a $50,000 transaction at an exclusive high-end jewelry boutique in Manhattan. I had purchased a diamond necklace for Brittany. He used the exact emergency funds I had secretly deposited into the firm just 2 months ago to keep him from declaring bankruptcy. He was using my hard-earned money, my family's hidden wealth, to play the role of a billionaire sugar daddy for his mistress. A slow, cold, genuine smile spread across my face. The supportive, invisible, long-suffering wife died right there on that frozen New York sidewalk. The woman who remained was Maya Caldwell, the sole heir to a real estate empire that could crush his tiny, pathetic firm with a single phone call. I reached deep into the hidden zippered compartment of my soaked designer bag and pulled out a heavy matte black credit card. It had no spending limit and bore the crest of Caldwell Enterprises. I bypassed the line of yellow cabs idling on the street corner and dialed a private concierge transport service I had not utilized since I was in my early 20s. I instructed the dispatcher to send their best luxury transport vehicle directly to my location and to take me straight to the commercial terminals at JFK Airport. While I waited, I opened my administrative banking application. Terrell liked to describe himself as the sole owner of his architecture firm, but the legal structure told a very different story. Through Apex Holdings, I controlled 65% of the voting shares. Terrell held the remaining equity and the title of founder and chief executive officer, which was more than enough for his ego to convince him the company belonged entirely to him. With 3 simple, deliberate taps on my freezing screen, I completely locked Terrell out of every single corporate account. I froze his business credit lines, canceled his company cards, and triggered a total financial hold on his entire operating budget. Let him try to buy expensive champagne and luxury suites in Las Vegas with declined cards. I opened the private aviation application tied to Caldwell Enterprises. One of our Gulfstream jets was already positioned at JFK after delivering an executive team that afternoon. I sent a priority request to have the aircraft fueled and cleared for an immediate flight to Las Vegas. Terrell thought he was flying there to secure his empire, pitch my stolen designs, and enjoy a weekend of infidelity. He was actually flying straight into an inferno. I was going to let him reach the absolute height of his arrogance. I was going to let him walk into that glittering ballroom thinking he was the king of the world. And then I was going to burn his entire existence to the ground. The interior of the luxury sport utility vehicle was a sanctuary of warm leather and absolute silence. I sank into the plush rear seat, letting the heavy doors close out the freezing New York wind and the bitter reality of the last 10 years of my life. As the driver navigated the slick, rain-soaked streets toward the airport, the ambient lighting of the cabin illuminated the dripping hem of my trench coat. It was a stark reminder of the woman my husband thought he had just left behind in the gutter, but the woman sitting in this vehicle was wide awake and dangerous. My phone resting on the mahogany console between the seats began to vibrate with a violent rhythmic intensity. It was not a phone call. It was a rapid succession of automated banking alerts. I picked up the device and watched the screen light up with sheer audacity. Terrell was actively trying to drain our shared corporate accounts. He was standing in some private jet terminal attempting to swipe his company card for exorbitant amounts of money. The first alert was for $25,000 at a luxury casino resort in Las Vegas. Denied. 2 minutes later, another attempt for $15,000 at an exclusive high-end boutique in Manhattan. Denied. He was trying to fund a lavish, hedonistic weekend with his mistress, using the exact emergency funds I had personally injected into his failing architecture firm just 3 weeks prior. He thought he could bleed me dry while leaving me stranded in the freezing sleet. The sheer entitlement of it made my blood boil, but my hands remained completely steady as I watched the denial notifications stack up on my screen. Then came the text message. His name flashed across my screen, demanding my immediate attention. I opened the message and read his frantic, manipulative words. Maya approved the banking transfer right now. The fraud department blocked my corporate card, and I have a major investor waiting for me in Las Vegas. If I do not secure this funding tonight, the firm will go under. Stop being petty about the flight and authorize the release of funds immediately. This is business. Do not ruin this for me. Business. I was calling his luxurious getaway with his blonde secretary business. For 10 years, I had believed his endless excuses. I had accepted his apologies when he missed our anniversary dinners because he was supposedly wooing clients. I had smiled politely when he told me my presence at industry galas was unnecessary because I did not understand corporate networking. I had shrunk myself down to make him feel like a giant. But looking at his text message now, demanding I finance his infidelity under the guise of an investment emergency, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculated resolve. I did not text him back. I did not demand an explanation or scream into the phone. I simply swiped the notification away and opened a heavily encrypted application on my phone. I logged directly into my private server, navigating past layers of security that Terrell could not even begin to comprehend. The screen loaded a series of complex legal documents, financial portfolios, and corporate ownership structures. 6 months ago, I had noticed the first subtle shifts in his behavior. The unexplained late nights, the sudden defensiveness regarding his phone, the distinct scent of cheap floral perfume on his collar. Unlike the naive wife he believed me to be, I did not confront him with tears and accusations. I contacted the most ruthless corporate attorneys my father had on his payroll. My attorneys began with a quiet internal forensic review of every account connected to Apex Holdings. Within weeks, they found far more than evidence of an affair. There were unexplained transfers, vendor invoices that did not match any legitimate project, and money moving through accounts. Brittany appeared to be helping Terrell manage. I ordered my attorneys to preserve everything. Once they had documented enough suspicious financial activity, they referred the records to federal investigators. From that moment forward, the case no longer belonged to me. The investigators began conducting their own independent review, while I continued behaving like the oblivious, supportive wife Terrell expected to see. I never told him. By the week of the gala, the investigators had independently corroborated enough of the financial trail to seek sealed warrants. I did not control when they would act. I only knew they were prepared to move once Terrell reached Las Vegas. I spent months methodically securing my assets and laying a flawless legal trap. Terrell believed he was the sole founder and primary stakeholder of his architectural firm. He loved to boast about his self-made success to anyone who would listen, especially to his own family. He was entirely unaware that the initial seed money, the subsequent bailouts, and the operational capital all came from a venture capital group called Apex Holdings. He assumed it was just a faceless investment firm that believed in his vision. He signed the operational contracts without reading the fine print, far too blinded by his own arrogance to realize what he was actually agreeing to. As I scrolled through the digital files on my phone, the undeniable truth was right there in black and white. Apex Holdings was my private investment corporation, and I owned it outright. Through Apex, I controlled the majority of Terrell's firm and every major corporate decision that came with that voting power. He had a meaningful equity stake and the title of founder and chief executive officer. What he did not have was controlling power. Apex controlled 65% of the voting shares, the board, and every major corporate decision. Terrell was not powerless. He was simply never the unchecked owner he had spent 10 years pretending to be. The satisfaction of that reality washed over me as the luxury vehicle pulled up to the curb of the commercial terminal. I locked my phone and slipped it into my pocket. The driver quickly exited the vehicle, opening my door and offering an umbrella to shield me from the continuing sleet. I stepped out onto the pavement, pulling my damp trench coat tightly around myself. I did not look like the billionaire heiress of a massive real estate dynasty. I looked like a tired, rain-soaked woman who had just endured a terrible betrayal. And that was exactly how I wanted to appear. The element of surprise is a weapon, and I was fully armed. I walked through the sliding glass doors into the bustling airport terminal. The bright fluorescent lights and the chaotic energy of hurried travelers were a sharp contrast to the quiet, lethal focus building inside my mind. I made my way toward the elevators that led to the exclusive first-class lounges. As I approached the luxury concourse, a loud, obnoxious laugh echoed through the corridor. I recognized that grating sound immediately. Standing near the frosted glass doors of the VIP lounge were Terrell's sister Chloe and her husband Julian. Chloe was dressed in an ostentatious designer tracksuit, clutching a luxury handbag that I knew for a fact Terrell had purchased for her using my money. Julian stood beside her wearing a tailored suit that barely hid his smug, entitled demeanor. They were waiting for their own flight to Las Vegas, undoubtedly invited by Terrell to enjoy a free, lavish weekend funded by my hidden bank accounts. I kept my head high and continued walking toward the lounge entrance. I had absolutely no intention of engaging with them, but Julian spotted me before I could walk past. His pale face lit up with a malicious, mocking grin. He nudged Chloe, pointing a finger directly at my soaked coat and ruined shoes. "Well, look what the storm dragged in," Julian announced loudly, ensuring that several nearby travelers turned to look. "I thought Terrell left you crying in the gutter where you belong. What are you doing here, Maya? Did you follow us to beg for spare change?" Chloe let out a sharp, derisive laugh, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Julian is right. You look completely pathetic, Maya. Terrell told us he was finally dropping your dead weight this weekend. You really should have taken the hint and gone back to whatever cheap neighborhood you crawled out of. You do not belong in a place like this." I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still, looking at the two people who had made my life a living nightmare at every family gathering for the past 5 years. Julian had always despised me, making constant microaggressions about my skin tone, my natural hair, and my supposed lack of class. Chloe had enabled his racism, perfectly content to tear down another black woman just to secure her own proximity to Julian's perceived superiority. They believed I was powerless. They believed I was utterly defeated. "You are standing in my way, Julian," I said, my voice steady, completely devoid of the panic or humiliation they so desperately wanted to see. "Move aside. I have a flight to catch." Julian scoffed, stepping squarely in front of the VIP lounge doors, physically blocking my path. "A flight to catch, please. The only thing you are catching is a cold. This area is for premium ticket holders, Maya. Not charity cases trying to track down their cheating husbands." He crossed his arms, puffing out his chest with unearned authority. "You need to leave before I have you thrown out." I did not back down. I maintained direct eye contact, refusing to let him intimidate me. "I am a ticketed passenger. Now step aside." Instead of moving, Julian turned his head and shouted toward a pair of airport security guards patrolling the concourse. "Officers, we have a problem over here." He pointed at me aggressively as the guards jogged over. "This woman is harassing us. She is a homeless stalker trying to force her way into the VIP lounge. Look at her. She is soaking wet and clearly unstable. I want her removed from the premises immediately." Chloe crossed her arms, nodding vigorously in agreement. "She is dangerous. She has been following my husband and me around the airport. You need to escort her out before she attacks someone." The two security guards approached me, their expressions stern and suspicious. Ma, I am going to have to ask you to step away from these passengers and show me your boarding pass. If you cannot provide a valid premium ticket, you will be escorted off the property." Julian crossed his arms, a victorious sneer plastered across his face. He looked at me as if I were absolute trash waiting for the security guards to drag me out into the cold night. He was waiting for me to break down to cry, to beg for mercy. I did not beg. I did not cry. I reached into my damp pocket, but I did not pull out a boarding pass. I pulled out my identification and handed it directly to the senior security officer, maintaining a perfectly calm, icy smile. The officer glanced down at the identification. His expression changed immediately. The card did not identify me as an ordinary commercial passenger. It carried my full legal name and the private aviation credentials issued through Caldwell Enterprises. "Maya Caldwell," he read quietly. Julian let out a mocking laugh. "Caldwell. Please, that is supposed to impress us." Before the officer could answer, a sharply dressed man hurried out of the private aviation corridor behind him. He wore the discreet badge of the executive director responsible for the terminal's private operations. "Ms. Caldwell," he said breathlessly, "I apologize. Your aircraft has been fueled and the crew is waiting. We were told you would be arriving through the commercial entrance." The senior security officer immediately handed my identification back to me. "My apologies, Ms. Caldwell." Julian's smile disappeared. Chloe stared from the aviation director to me. "Your aircraft," she repeated. I slipped my identification back into my pocket. "The Gulfstream." Nobody laughed this time. The aviation director stepped aside and gestured toward the secured corridor. "This way, Ms. Caldwell." I walked past Julian without giving him another look. I was ready to watch their arrogant world shatter into pieces. The heavy acoustic doors of the Gulfstream G650 closed, instantly shutting out the biting New York wind and the pathetic gaping faces of my sister-in-law Chloe and her racist husband Julian. I left them standing on the polished floor of the terminal, completely paralyzed by the realization that the homeless stalker they had just tried to have arrested was being personally escorted by the terminal's private aviation director. I did not look back. I simply handed my ruined, rain-soaked trench coat to the flight attendant, who received it with white-gloved hands and sank into the cream-colored leather of the main cabin. The quiet luxury of the private jet was a sharp contrast to the freezing pavement I had been standing on less than an hour ago. As the aircraft began to taxi down the private runway, the encrypted satellite phone built into the mahogany console beside my seat began to chime. I knew exactly who it was. The caller identification flashed the private line of my father's executive assistant. I picked up the receiver, taking a slow, centering breath. Before I could even offer a greeting, the assistant rapidly informed me that she was transferring me directly to the chairman. A second later, the deep, thunderous voice of my father, Richard Caldwell, filled my ear. He did not say hello. He demanded answers. "Maya, I am looking at the final seating chart for the Platinum VIP table at my gala tonight. The table clearly marked for the Caldwell family. I see your husband's name submitted for the center seats, but the name listed as his +1 is not yours. The name on my manifest is Brittany. Who is this woman, and why is my daughter not sitting next to the man she married?" My father is a titan in the commercial real estate world. He built the Caldwell empire from absolutely nothing, navigating the ruthless, heavily segregated business landscape of the 1970s as a brilliant, uncompromising black man. He raised me to be a predator in the boardroom, to demand respect, and to never let anyone diminish my worth. Hearing the raw, protective fury in his voice cracked the icy armor I had built up around my heart all evening, but I refused to crumble. I sat up straighter in my seat, watching the city lights drop away as the jet climbed into the night sky. I told him the truth. I told him that Terrell was currently flying to Las Vegas on a chartered plane paid for by our joint business account, with his 20-something secretary occupying my seat. I told him about the affair I had suspected for months, and the absolute humiliation Terrell had subjected me to on the sidewalk outside the terminal. I did not soften the blow. I did not make excuses for the man I had married. The silence on the other end of the line was terrifying. When my father finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a lethal quiet register that meant someone was about to lose everything. He asked me why I had hidden this from him. He wanted to know why I had spent 10 years dimming my own light dressing down and pretending to be nothing more than a supportive housewife just to make a mediocre man feel tall. He reminded me of my own brilliance, of the degrees I held, of the sharp business acumen I possessed that rivaled his own. I admitted my mistake. I confessed that I had wanted a marriage built on a foundation of struggle and mutual growth, not one overshadowed by the intimidating weight of the Caldwell fortune. I wanted Terrell to love Maya the woman, not Maya the billionaire heiress. I had funneled my own capital into his failing firm because I believed in his potential. But in doing so, I had completely enabled his arrogance. My father scoffed a bitter, angry sound. He told me that Terrell's arrogance was about to cost him his career. Richard then brought up the cornerstone of Terrell's entire upcoming presentation at the gala. Tonight, Terrell was scheduled to pitch a massive urban development proposal directly to the Caldwell Investment Board. It was a revolutionary green architecture blueprint designed to transform low-income neighborhoods into sustainable, eco-friendly, affordable housing complexes without displacing the original communities. It was the kind of visionary project that could redefine a developer's entire legacy. My father told me he had reviewed the preliminary sketches Terrell submitted last week. Richard said he knew instantly that Terrell lacked the depth, the cultural understanding, and the sheer architectural talent to conceptualize something so profoundly brilliant. He asked me directly if the designs belonged to me. I closed my eyes, feeling a fresh wave of violation wash over me. Yes, I told him. They were my designs. I had spent 2 years working on those blueprints in my home office late into the night. I had developed the project independently through Apex Holdings, long before Terrell decided to use it for his pitch. Every major revision was time-stamped on my private server, and the completed design package had already been formally assigned to Apex. Terrell had no ownership rights to the project beyond the unauthorized copies he stole. I had poured my soul into that project, drawing from our own community's history, blending environmental sustainability with cultural preservation. It was my masterpiece. Terrell had completely bypassed my secure server at home, downloaded the digital files onto his own flash drive, and slapped his firm's logo on the title page. I was going to stand on my father's stage tonight and use my life's work to secure millions of dollars in Caldwell funding, planning to divorce me the second the money cleared his accounts. My father did not hesitate. He commanded his assistant, who was listening on the secure line, to immediately revoke Terrell's access to the Bellagio. He wanted Terrell barred from the property, his firm permanently blacklisted from every commercial real estate venture on the West Coast, and his personal accounts seized by our legal team before his chartered flight even touched the tarmac. Richard wanted to crush him instantly, leaving him with absolutely nothing upon arrival. "No," I said, my voice cutting through my father's commands. "Do not lock him out." My father paused, clearly confused and deeply frustrated by my request. He demanded to know why I would allow a thief and a traitor to step foot inside our hotel. I explained my strategy. If we locked him out now, Terrell would spin the narrative. He would play the victim, claiming he was unfairly targeted by a vindictive wife and a monopolizing corporation. He would take my blueprints to a rival firm and eventually find someone foolish enough to fund him. I needed his destruction to be absolute, public, and undeniable. I told my father to let Terrell walk down the red carpet. Let him drink our expensive champagne and shake hands with the industry executives. Let him stand at the podium and look out at the crowd, believing he had finally conquered the world. I wanted him at the absolute highest peak of his delusion before I personally kicked the ladder out from under him. My father listened to my plan. I could hear the slow, proud shift in his breathing. The fury in his voice was replaced by a deep, resonant satisfaction. He told me I was truly a Caldwell, and that he would have the stage prepped exactly as I requested. He promised me the floor the moment the banquet commenced. I ended the call as the flight attendant quietly placed a glass of sparkling water on the table beside me. I thanked her and reached into my leather carry-on bag, pulling out my personal laptop. I opened the sleek metal device, the screen casting a pale blue glow across the darkened cabin. I connected to the jet's secure satellite internet and accessed the cloud server that Terrell still believed was solely his private domain. Terrell was not a cautious man. He was arrogant, and arrogant men always leave a digital trail. Because I was the silent majority owner of his shell corporation, my administrative clearance superseded his. I easily bypassed the two-factor authentication on his primary presentation folder. I found the exact master presentation folder Terrell used across his laptop and presentation tablet. Both devices were configured to synchronize automatically with the firm's cloud server whenever they connected to the internet. I still held administrator access to that server through Apex Holdings. Terrell also carried a flash drive as a backup, but the live presentation file he intended to use at the gala was synchronized directly from the cloud. I did not delete the blueprints. Deleting them would just prompt him to use a backup file or claim technical difficulties. I needed a trap that would spring exactly when he was most vulnerable. I opened a command terminal and began writing a specialized self-executing script. It was an advanced digital watermark, a piece of code that would remain completely dormant and invisible while he clicked through the initial slides of his pitch. I tied the script to the protected blueprint files themselves. The title slide would remain available through Terrell's ordinary presentation account, but the actual blueprint files were now restricted to Apex Authorized Design Group. Terrell's account was no longer on that list. The first time he or anyone using his account attempted to open one of the protected design slides, the file would lock automatically and display the ownership notice. He would see the title slide normally. The moment he tried to open the actual architectural drawings, the trap would spring. I carefully typed the words that would appear in that banner. Access denied. Intellectual property of Maya Caldwell and Apex Holdings. Unauthorized use or distribution prohibited. I reviewed the code, ensuring there were no errors and no possibility of him bypassing the lock once it triggered. It was a flawless digital dead man's switch. With a steady hand and a cold, unyielding sense of purpose, I hit the enter key. The upload progress bar flashed across my screen, hitting 100% in seconds. The synchronized presentation updated silently across the devices connected to his corporate account. The trap was set. I closed my laptop and leaned back against the leather headrest, looking out the window into the endless dark sky. The lights of Las Vegas would soon appear on the horizon, a glittering oasis of money, power, and deception. Terrell was flying toward the city expecting to win the jackpot. He had no idea the house always wins, and I owned the house. The descent into Las Vegas was a smooth glide through the glittering neon landscape of the Nevada desert. When the wheels of the private jet touched down on the exclusive tarmac at Harry Reid International Airport, I felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. The freezing rain of New York was a distant memory. Out here, the dry desert air felt like an entirely different world. A convoy of 3 black armored vehicles was waiting before the aircraft even came to a complete stop. My father's security team stood at attention by the stairs. They did not ask questions or unnecessary pleasantries. They ushered me into the lead vehicle with practiced efficiency, and we sped toward the dazzling lights of the Las Vegas Strip. I stared out the tinted windows at the towering casinos, knowing Terrell was somewhere in this vibrant city, desperately trying to use his declined corporate cards to impress a woman who only wanted his money. We pulled up to the private, secured underground entrance of the Caldwell Bellagio. The general manager of the hotel was waiting anxiously by the elevator bank. His head was bowed respectfully as he swiped a gold keycard to grant me direct access to the owner's penthouse. The elevator shot upward, leaving the frantic noise and flashing lights of the casino floor far below. The polished doors slid open to reveal a sprawling suite enclosed in floor-to-ceiling glass. The spectacular lights of the city reflected off pristine marble floors, but the true commanding presence in the room was my father. Richard Caldwell was pacing relentlessly in front of the panoramic windows, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He wore a custom-tailored suit radiating the absolute authority that made industry veterans tremble. The moment he saw me step out of the elevator, he stopped pacing. His jaw was clenched, and the raw protective fury radiating from him was a physical force. He did not offer a gentle hug or ask how my flight was. He walked straight over to me, looking at my still damp clothing and my waterlogged shoes with pure disgust. It was not disgust aimed at me, but a lethal hatred for the man who dared to treat his bloodline like disposable garbage on a public sidewalk. Maya, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed ominously across the massive suite. I have my chief of security on standby downstairs. I want that pathetic excuse for a man dragged out of this hotel right now by his collar. I want his luxury luggage tossed directly into the street, and I want his precious architectural firm liquidated before the gala even begins tonight. He turned away and picked up a tablet from the mahogany desk, scrolling through the live security feeds of the hotel lobby. My father was a man of immediate action. He had built his real estate empire by crushing his enemies the exact second they showed him disrespect. He wanted to strip Terrell of his dignity, right there in the lobby, exposing his financial ruin in front of tourists and industry rivals arriving for the event. He wanted to cancel the urban development pitch entirely and publicly humiliate Terrell for bringing his mistress to a Caldwell-sponsored event while leaving his wife in the rain. I watched my father dial his security chief's private number, fully ready to give the execution order. I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly over his phone, lowering it to the polished surface of the desk. "No," I said, maintaining steady eye contact with the man who had taught me everything I knew about power and business strategy. "You are not going to touch him. Not yet." My father stared at me, his dark eyes narrowing in fierce protective opposition. He demanded to know why I would extend a single second of mercy to a man who had left me freezing in the sleet to cater to his blonde secretary. He argued that Terrell had violated the ultimate code of respect and deserved to be humiliated without delay. I did not back down. I calmly explained that immediate eviction was not a true punishment. It was merely a temporary inconvenience. If we threw Terrell out now before he had the chance to present his pitch, he would immediately spin a narrative of false victimhood. He would run to his network of wealthy white developers and claim the Caldwell family was using their corporate influence to bully a self-made black architect. He would take my stolen green architecture blueprints to a rival firm, manipulate the story, and eventually find a gullible investor to fund his fraudulent dreams. He would cast me as a bitter, jealous wife who used her rich daddy to ruin his honest hard work. I paced across the cool marble floor, matching my father's intensity step for step. "I want him on that stage tonight," I insisted, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I want him to look out at the audience of industry titans and billionaire investors. I want him to feel the intoxicating rush of victory. He needs to believe he has won everything he ever wanted. He needs to think his pitch is a total success. Because when a man like Terrell falls from the curb, he simply brushes himself off and blames the pavement. But when he falls from the absolute peak of the mountain, he shatters into a million pieces." I watched the rigid tension slowly leave my father's broad shoulders. The protective anger in his eyes gradually morphed into deep, resonant pride. He recognized the ruthless, calculated strategy of a true Caldwell. A slow, dark smile spread across his handsome face as he fully understood the magnificent magnitude of the trap I had carefully set. "You want him to present the stolen work," my father said softly, shaking his head in sheer admiration. I nodded. "I wanted Terrell to publicly claim ownership of my intellectual property right before I destroyed him in front of every major investor in the country. I needed the betrayal to be public, undeniable, and entirely of his own making." My father let out a booming, impressed laugh that filled the penthouse. He turned and walked toward the heavily fortified wall safe concealed behind a contemporary painting. He entered the combination, and the heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying thud. He reached inside and pulled out a thick legal manila envelope sealed with red wax. He walked back to me, his expression turning incredibly serious, and placed the heavy envelope directly into my hands. "Inside this envelope are the recorded ownership documents for the high-rise where Terrell houses his architectural firm headquarters," my father said. "I bought the building through a proxy corporation 3 years ago when I began to realize how completely his firm depended on you. At closing, I transferred the ownership interest into your private holding company. You have owned that building ever since." Terrell simply never knew who his real landlord was. My father placed the documents firmly into my hands. "You own the ground beneath his feet, the roof over his head, and the walls surrounding the empire he thinks belongs to him. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, feeling the immense weight of the power it represented. For 10 years, I had played the quiet, supportive background character, while Terrell paraded around pretending to be a visionary. I had hidden my wealth, my lineage, and my true capabilities to protect his fragile ego. But holding the deed to his entire professional existence, I felt the last lingering threads of that compliant woman dissolve completely. You have my full blessing to burn his empire to the ground tonight. My father continued, placing a proud hand on my shoulder. Show him what happens when you disrespect a Caldwell. Show every single person in that ballroom exactly who you are, Maya. Leave him with nothing. I looked up at my father, clutching the master deed tightly against my chest. A cold, fierce determination settled deep into my bones. The rain-soaked victim who had been left on the airport sidewalk was gone forever. The woman standing in this penthouse was ready for war. I promised him. By midnight, Terrell will not even have a desk to clear out. The heavy wooden doors of the penthouse closed behind me as I stepped back into the private elevator. My phone buzzed in my hand with a new calendar alert. It was a shared notification from Terrell's schedule, happily announcing his arrival at the grand ballroom downstairs. He was probably standing on the red carpet right now, proudly flashing his perfect, arrogant smile for the industry photographers, completely unaware that his entire reality was resting inside the manila envelope I carried. I pressed the button for the lobby level. As the elevator descended rapidly through the towering hotel, I took one last deep breath. The time for hiding my true identity was officially over. I stepped out into the bright, glittering corridor, fully ready to finally claim my rightful throne. From the private elevator, I crossed the silent, velvet-lined corridor toward my designated VIP dressing suite. The heavy master deed to Terrell's office building remained safely locked in the penthouse vault above me. I did not need to carry the physical paperwork to know I held his entire world in the palm of my hand. I pushed open the double doors of the suite and walked straight into the massive marble bathroom, dropping my clutch onto the vanity. I caught my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror and simply stared. The woman looking back at me was soaked, exhausted, and completely hidden beneath a drab and shapeless beige trench coat. For 10 long years, Terrell had aggressively curated this exact aesthetic for me. He had fed me a constant toxic narrative that my natural curves, my rich dark skin, and my tightly coiled natural hair needed to be muted and controlled. He convinced me that to be respected as the wife of a rising architect in his elite, predominantly white corporate circles, I needed to blend into the background. I needed to look approachable, modest, and ultimately invisible. I stripped off the wet clothes and dropped them directly into the trash can. That subservient, brainwashed woman was dead. I stepped into the steaming marble shower and let the scalding water wash away the freezing New York rain, the stale air of the overnight flight, and the lingering residue of a decade of painful compromise. The warm water cascaded over my shoulders, washing away the shame I had carried for far too long. I stood under the heavy stream until I felt entirely purified, ready to step into the next chapter of my existence. When I walked back into the main bedroom, wrapped in a plush robe, my father's elite styling team was already waiting for me. They had flown in from Los Angeles the moment my father gave the word, bringing heavy steel trunks filled with absolute perfection. For the next 2 hours, there was absolutely no conversation in the room. There was only the precise, deliberate work of a total transformation. They swept my thick, natural hair into a stunning, sculptural updo that commanded absolute respect and celebrated exactly who I was as a proud African-American woman. They applied makeup that highlighted the deep, rich undertones of my skin, accentuating my high cheekbones and giving my eyes a fierce, predatory edge. Then came the masterpiece. They brought out the dress my father had commissioned for me months ago, praying I would one day find the courage to stop hiding. It was a custom couture gown in a breathtaking shade of deep emerald green. The heavy, luxurious silk draped flawlessly over my figure, featuring an elegant plunging neckline and a dramatic sweeping train that whispered with every single step I took. It was not a dress designed for a supportive wife standing in the shadows. It was the impenetrable armor of a billionaire heiress ready to reclaim her empire. I slipped my feet into a pair of towering gold-strapped stilettos that elevated my stature, making me look every bit the untouchable force I was born to be. Finally, my father's assistant handed me a velvet box. Inside rested a heavy, authentic diamond and emerald collar necklace. I fastened it around my throat, letting the cold jewels settle against my collarbone like a promise of absolute vengeance. I picked up a sleek metallic clutch, sliding my phone and a specific sealed manila envelope inside. I was ready. I left the private dressing suite and walked toward the grand marble staircase that overlooked the main foyer of the Caldwell Bellagio. The muffled, chaotic energy of the National Developers Gala echoed up from the floor below. Hundreds of industry executives, wealthy investors, and hungry socialites were mingling outside the massive ballroom doors. I paused at the very top of the stairs, taking one deep, centering breath. As I began my descent, the ambient noise in the grand foyer slowly began to die down. Event staff and security personnel stationed along the perimeter snapped to immediate attention, their eyes wide with recognition and awe. Wealth might whisper, but generational power commands the room without making a single sound. The rhythmic click of my heels against the marble stairs cut through the thinning chatter. People who had absolutely no idea who I was parted like the Red Sea as I reached the ground floor, instinctively sensing that I owned the very ground they were standing on. I moved fluidly through the crowd, my emerald train gliding silently behind me. I positioned myself behind a towering arrangement of white orchids near the entrance to the red carpet, completely concealed from the outside view. Through the heavy glass doors, the media circus was in full swing. Camera flashes fired in rapid, blinding bursts against the night sky. And right there, standing dead center in front of a massive media wall, was my husband. Terrell was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo I had secretly paid for, flashing that same arrogant, charming smile I had spent 10 years adoring, and clinging tightly to his arm, wearing a highly inappropriate sequined dress that left nothing to the imagination, was Brittany. Around her neck glittered the $50,000 diamond necklace Terrell had purchased from the corporate account earlier that evening. My husband was brazenly posing for industry photographers with his 20-something secretary less than 6 hours after leaving me freezing on a New York sidewalk. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was staggering. I watched as a reporter from a major real estate publication stepped up with a microphone asking Terrell about the stunning woman on his arm. I could hear Terrell's voice booming through the nearby lobby speakers, smooth, confident, and entirely deceitful. "I want to introduce everyone to Brittany," Terrell announced, wrapping his arm tightly around her waist and pulling her into his side. "She is my fiancée and the brilliant business partner who led the creative design on the revolutionary green architecture project I will be presenting tonight." My blood turned to absolute ice. Fiancée. He was publicly claiming his secretary as his future wife while still legally married to me. But his arrogant words were not the trigger that sent a white-hot spike of rage through my chest. It was what Brittany did next. She giggled a high-pitched grating sound and raised her left hand toward the flashing cameras to show off her new jewelry. Resting perfectly on her ring finger was a massive vintage cushion-cut diamond. My breath caught in my throat. It was my late grandmother's engagement ring, the priceless sacred family heirloom that my mother had passed down to me on her deathbed. Terrell had specifically told me it was too outdated and fragile to ever wear in public, convincing me to keep it safely hidden in a velvet box at the back of my vanity. He had stolen my grandmother's ring from my own bedroom to propose to his mistress using the wealth I had secretly built for him. My chest tightened, a sharp physical ache blooming behind my ribs as I stared at the stolen diamond glittering under the press lights. A lesser woman would have pushed through those heavy glass doors screaming. A lesser woman would have marched straight onto that red carpet, slapped the smug smile off his face, and ripped that diamond right off Brittany's finger in front of 50 flashing cameras. But I was not a lesser woman. I was a Caldwell. We do not throw tantrums for the paparazzi. We execute calculated, flawless corporate slaughter. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the white-hot rage solidify into pure, impenetrable ice. I turned my back on the sickening display of their stolen happiness. My face was a mask of pure, terrifying calm. I walked deliberately around the perimeter of the foyer, completely bypassing the media frenzy, and headed straight for the administrative check-in area. The chief press coordinator, a frantic woman with a headset and a thick clipboard, was shouting hurried instructions to her junior staff. I stepped up to her desk. The exact moment she looked up and saw me, she froze her eyes, scanning the impossible wealth radiating from my emerald gown and diamond collar. She recognized instantly that I was someone who operated far above her pay grade. I offered her a polite, terrifyingly calm smile and reached into my metallic clutch. I pulled out the sealed manila envelope. During my flight, my father's legal team had coordinated with the federal investigators already handling the financial case. By the time I reached the gala, the investigators had obtained the court orders they needed, and my attorneys had prepared a separate public evidence packet for the press. I placed the envelope gently but firmly onto the center of her clipboard. Distribute copies of the documents inside this folder to every single major financial journalist in the main ballroom tonight, I instructed, my voice unwavering and laced with absolute authority. But you will instruct them not to open these folders under any circumstances until exactly midnight. Do you understand me? The coordinator swallowed hard, nodding rapidly, without daring to ask a single question or check my credentials. She recognized a directive from the top of the food chain. I thanked her, turned on my heel, and walked toward the grand entrance of the main ballroom. Terrell thought he was going to conquer the world tonight. I was going to make sure he left in handcuffs. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open before me, pulled back by two white-gloved security guards who bowed their heads in silent respect. I stepped across the threshold, and the sheer magnitude of the National Developers Gala washed over me. The room was a sprawling cathedral of wealth and corporate ambition, carefully designed to intimidate and impress. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, fragmented light across hundreds of tables draped in black silk. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, roasted filet mignon, and the quiet, desperate hum of aggressive networking. This was the absolute pinnacle of the real estate industry, a gathering of the most ruthless minds in the country. Everyone who was anyone had flown into Las Vegas tonight to beg for a fraction of my father's attention. I moved smoothly through the perimeter of the room, my emerald green gown catching the light with every graceful step. My eyes scanned the vast expanse of the ballroom, cutting through the endless sea of tailored suits and designer dresses. I was looking for one specific table, the Platinum VIP table. The table positioned directly dead center in front of the main stage, reserved exclusively for the most powerful individuals in the room. It did not take me long to find it. My gaze locked onto the front row, and a fresh wave of cold, calculated fury settled deep into my bones. There, sitting right in the middle of the Platinum VIP table, was my husband. Terrell was leaning back in his velvet chair, holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne, laughing loudly at something a rival developer had just said. And sitting right beside him, pressing her shoulder aggressively against his chest, was Brittany. She was sipping her drink and flashing my late grandmother's diamond ring to anyone who looked in her direction. But the absolute worst part was not their sickening display of affection. It was the elegant gold placard resting in the center of their table. The placard clearly read, "Caldwell Family." Terrell had taken the seating assignment meant for my father and me. He had marched into this ballroom, seen my family name on the most prestigious table in the building, and arrogantly claimed it for himself and his mistress. He genuinely believed that because he was pitching a project tonight, he was entitled to the highest honors available. He thought he was the undisputed king of the castle, completely unaware that he was trespassing on my ancestral throne. I began to walk down the wide center aisle, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. The heavy emerald silk of my dress glided silently across the carpet. I kept my head high, my posture radiating the absolute authority my father had instilled in me since childhood. As I closed the remaining distance, Terrell happened to glance up from his animated conversation. His eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine shock register on his handsome face. I took in the custom couture gown, the flawless styling of my natural hair, and the blinding emerald collar resting against my dark skin. He saw a powerful woman he did not recognize, a woman who looked far more expensive than his entire firm combined. But his momentary shock quickly morphed into deep, ugly anger. In his delusional mind, he assumed I had maxed out our remaining credit cards or rented a designer wardrobe just to show up and embarrass him in public. He abruptly slammed his champagne glass onto the table, spilling wine onto the crisp white tablecloth. He muttered a quick excuse to the wealthy investors sitting nearby, pushed his chair back, and marched directly toward me with purposeful, heavy strides. He intercepted me halfway down the aisle, stepping directly into my path to physically block me from reaching the VIP area. He reached out and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging aggressively into my skin through the silk fabric. The sudden violent contact sent a jolt of pure revulsion through my body, but I did not pull away. I stood perfectly still, looking down at his hand, and then slowly raised my eyes to meet his furious glare. "What is wrong with you, Maya?" He hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper, so the surrounding tables would not overhear his outburst. "Are you completely insane? I explicitly told you to stay at a cheap motel. You come crashing in here wearing some rented costume, trying to ruin the most important night of my entire career. You are embarrassing me in front of billionaires. People are starting to stare." I looked at him with absolute terrifying calm. "You are standing in my way, Terrell," I replied evenly, my tone colder than the New York rain he had left me in. "Take your hand off me right now." He tightened his grip, his eyes flashing with a desperate, ugly need for control. "You are not going to ruin my critical networking tonight," he growled, stepping closer to intimidate me. "I have major investors ready to write me massive checks based on my designs. You need to leave this room right now before I call security. Go find the service kitchen in the back of the hotel and wait by the loading dock like the rest of the help. Do not let anyone else see your face in here." Before I could respond to his staggering, unforgivable disrespect, a high-pitched, grating laugh echoed right behind him. Brittany had followed him over from the VIP table. She stood there in her cheap, tightly fitted sequined dress, holding a full glass of dark red wine. "Oh my goodness, Terrell," she sneered, looking me up and down with utter contempt. "Is this your crazy, obsessive wife you told me about? She looks absolutely ridiculous. Did she really follow us all the way from New York just to beg for a tiny scrap of attention?" Brittany stepped much closer, her pale eyes locked onto the luxurious emerald silk of my custom gown. The sheer, unadulterated jealousy radiating from her was completely palpable. She hated that I looked better than she ever could. She lifted her wine glass, pretending to lose her balance on her ridiculous high heels. With a loud, exaggerated gasp, she thrust her arm forward with undeniable intent. A dark, heavy splash of deep red wine flew directly from her glass, landing squarely onto the front hem of my pristine couture gown. The dark, sticky liquid soaked instantly into the expensive, delicate silk, leaving a massive, glaring stain that ruined the fabric completely. "Oops," Brittany gasped loudly, her voice dripping with fake manufactured innocence. "I am so incredibly sorry. I guess I just tripped over my own feet. You should probably go run to the bathroom and try to scrub that out, Maya. Or better yet, just leave the premises immediately. You clearly do not belong at a sophisticated high-class event like this." Terrell did not reprimand her for ruining an incredibly expensive garment. He did not apologize for her atrocious, classless behavior. He just sighed heavily, looking at my ruined, stained dress with total, absolute disgust. "See what happens when you do not listen to me," he muttered, shaking his head as if I had brought this upon myself. "Now go clean yourself up and wait in the back service area like I told you. I do not want to see your face again until tomorrow morning." He turned his back on me completely, placing his hand affectionately on Brittany's lower back and guided her back toward the platinum VIP table. Any other woman would have screamed at the top of her lungs. Any other woman would have thrown a drink right back at their faces or caused a massive violent scene that would have hotel security running over to intervene. But I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear of humiliation. I simply looked down at the dark red stains spreading across my emerald dress and smiled a cold, victorious smile. I caught the eye of the head catering manager, who was standing near the swinging service doors, watching the entire exchange unfold with a horrified, sympathetic expression on his face. I walked gracefully over to him, maintaining my absolute dignity. I slipped a crisp $100 bill into his palm and quietly asked him to lend me a spare black catering blazer for the evening. He handed it over immediately, apologizing for the terrible behavior of the guests. I slipped the tailored black jacket over my shoulders, perfectly concealing the wine stain and my diamond collar. I was going to blend right into the shadows of the banquet hall. I wanted to serve them their next round of drinks and hear exactly what Terrell was saying behind my back before I destroyed his entire life completely. The black catering blazer was a sharp contrast to the luxurious emerald silk of my custom couture gown, but it served its purpose perfectly. I buttoned it up to my collarbone, completely concealing the massive wine stain Brittany had intentionally splashed across my waist, along with the heavy diamond and emerald collar resting against my throat. The tailored jacket was slightly too large across my shoulders, but in the dim, fragmented lighting of the grand ballroom, nobody would look twice. That is the ultimate secret of high society events. The wealthiest people in the room are entirely blind to the service staff. To men like Terrell and the rival developers, he was trying to impress. A black blazer meant you were invisible. You were nothing more than a pair of hands delivering expensive alcohol. It was the perfect disguise. I picked up a silver tray, holding a freshly opened bottle of premium vintage champagne and a perfectly polished cloth napkin. The ambient noise of the National Developers Gala washed over me, a chaotic symphony of clinking crystal string quartet music and the aggressive hum of corporate networking. I navigated through the labyrinth of circular tables, moving with the practiced, unobtrusive grace of a ghost. I kept my head slightly bowed, allowing the dim lighting to obscure my carefully styled hair and makeup. My target was the platinum VIP table dead center in the room where my husband was currently holding court. As I approached his table, I positioned myself strategically at the adjacent table, pouring drinks for a group of minor real estate brokers while keeping my back turned toward Terrell. The proximity was perfect. I could hear every single arrogant syllable spilling from his mouth. Terrell was leaning back in his velvet chair, completely immersed in a conversation with two extremely prominent rival developers. These were men who routinely outbid him on city contracts, men he had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to emulate. Tonight, however, Terrell was acting as if he was their superior. "I built my empire from the absolute ground up," Terrell boasted, his voice dripping with fabricated confidence. He swirled the amber liquid in his rocks glass, projecting the image of a self-made titan. "When I started my firm 10 years ago, nobody wanted to give a young architect a chance. I had to scrape together my own funding. I worked 80-hour weeks. I sacrificed everything to get to where I am today. And tonight, when Richard Caldwell sees what I have brought to the table, he is going to realize that I am the future of urban development on the West Coast." My grip tightened around the neck of the chilled champagne bottle I was holding. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his lies was breathtaking. He had never scraped together a single dime. I had funded his entire firm using my secret accounts. I had drafted the blueprints, managed the payroll, and quietly steered his company away from bankruptcy time and time again. Yet here he sat, erasing a decade of my immense financial and intellectual sacrifice to stroke his own massive ego in front of men who would never respect him. One of the rival developers, a silver-haired man with a sharp, calculating gaze, leaned forward across the white tablecloth. "You know, Terrell, the rumors in the industry always painted a different picture. Word on the street was that your wife was the quiet brains behind your operation. People say she handles all your internal logistics. Is she not here tonight to celebrate this massive Caldwell pitch with you?" Terrell let out a harsh, dismissive laugh that made my stomach turn. He waved his hand in the air as if swatting away an annoying insect. "Maya," he scoffed, shaking his head. "Maya is a dead weight. She is completely unimaginative. She has no vision for the future, no understanding of how high-level corporate networking actually operates. She just sits at home pushing paper around. To be completely honest with you, gentlemen, I am shedding that extra baggage first thing tomorrow morning." The table fell silent for a fraction of a second. I stood absolutely still, the silver tray heavy in my hands, listening to the man I married casually announce the end of our decade-long relationship. "The second, the Caldwell funding clears my business accounts tomorrow, my legal team is serving her with divorce papers." Terrell continued, his tone brutally cold and transactional. "I am cutting her loose. A man in my position needs a partner who actually matches his ambition. A partner who looks the part and brings true creative genius to the table. Someone who understands the modern real estate landscape. Right on cue. Brittany leaned aggressively into Terrell's shoulder. She placed her hand on his chest, ensuring the heavy vintage diamond ring Terrell had stolen from my vanity was clearly visible to the developer sitting across the table. She batted her pale eyelashes and offered a sickly sweet manufactured smile. Terrell is being far too modest. Brittany chimed in, her high-pitched voice grating against my nerves. The green architecture project he is presenting tonight is going to completely revolutionize urban housing. And I should know because I was the lead designer on the entire blueprint. We spent months collaborating on the structural aesthetics. It was my idea to incorporate the sustainable rooftop terraces and the culturally integrated community spaces. We truly are the perfect visionary team. The white-hot rage that spiked through my veins was almost paralyzing. Brittany was not an architect. She barely knew how to operate the basic scheduling software at the reception desk. She had never drafted a single load-bearing wall in her entire pathetic life. Those sustainable terraces and culturally integrated community spaces were born from my own late nights, my own heritage, and my own profound dedication to creating housing that uplifted African American communities, instead of gentrifying them. To hear this vapid, unqualified woman claim my life's work as her own was the ultimate desecration. The older developer raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued by the bold claims. That is quite a statement, young lady. A fully sustainable, culturally integrated housing complex that maintains affordable pricing, without relying on government subsidies, is the holy grail of modern development. We have been trying to crack that code for 5 years. Do you happen to have the preliminary schematics on hand? I would love to see what exactly you are pitching to Richard Caldwell tonight. Terrell's chest puffed out with undeniable pride. He eagerly reached into the interior pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. Of course, he said smoothly. I always keep the master files on my person. It pays to be prepared when you are surrounded by the best in the business. He reached down beside his chair and pulled his presentation tablet from a slim leather case. The device had synchronized with the firm's cloud server the moment he connected to the hotel network. Of course, he said smoothly. I always keep the full presentation with me. He unlocked the tablet and handed it directly across the table to the silver-haired developer. The man accepted it eagerly. The surrounding investors leaned closer, their eyes bright with predatory curiosity. They wanted to see the revolutionary designs that were supposedly going to secure the legendary Caldwell backing. I turned slightly, keeping my face shielded by my shoulder, and watched from the adjacent table. My heart beat with slow, glorious anticipation. The device had already synchronized with the file I modified on the private jet. The trap was waiting. The developer tapped the screen, opening the main presentation folder. The first slide loaded perfectly, displaying the sleek fabricated logo of Terrell's architecture firm, alongside Brittany's name, listed as the lead creative director. Terrell smiled smugly, crossing his arms over his chest, as the investors nodded in initial approval. The developer swiped his finger across the glass to transition to the actual architectural blueprints. The exact millisecond the second slide attempted to load, the tablet screen glitched violently. The elegant rendering of the urban housing complex vanished instantly. A blinding, blaring crimson-red background swallowed the entire display. A massive warning symbol appeared dead center, accompanied by bold capitalized white text that locked the screen completely. Access denied. Intellectual property of Maya Caldwell and Apex Holdings. Unauthorized use or distribution prohibited. The silver-haired developer gasped loudly, dropping the expensive tablet onto the white tablecloth as if it had physically burned his hands. The bright red warning glared up at the entire table. Terrell panicked, frantically lunging forward to snatch the tablet out of the developer's hands as the surrounding investors stared at him in deep, unmistakable suspicion. He clawed at the device, knocking over a crystal water goblet in his desperate rush. The screen remained frozen, blaring my name like a neon siren. Brittany shrank back into her chair, the stolen diamond suddenly feeling very heavy on her finger. The trap was sprung. The silver-haired developer sat entirely frozen in his velvet chair, staring down at the bright red warning screen, reflecting off his expensive reading glasses. The bold white words declaring the files as the intellectual property of Maya Caldwell blared like a silent, catastrophic alarm across the crisp white tablecloth. Terrell was practically hyperventilating. He finally snatched the tablet back and stabbed frantically at the power button, nearly knocking the high-end device onto the floor in his frantic, uncoordinated panic. The screen instantly went black, but the damage was already irreversibly done. The surrounding investors slowly leaned back in their seats, exchanging sharp, highly calculating glances. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, stealing intellectual property is not just a simple breach of corporate ethics. It is a fatal career-ending move. Nobody wants to fund a developer who cannot even secure his own digital blueprints without triggering a massive intellectual property ownership lock. Terrell desperately tried to laugh it off, but the sound was pathetic. His voice cracked, high-pitched and dripping with manufactured ease as he stammered out a ridiculous excuse. He frantically claimed it was just a strange technical glitch caused by a disgruntled former information technology employee who was trying to sabotage his big night. He locked the tablet and shoved it back into its leather case, his hands shaking so violently he could barely button his jacket. Brittany sat completely paralyzed beside him. She had just spent the last 10 minutes loudly claiming to these exact men that she was the lead creative director on those blueprints, and now she was staring down the barrel of a very public, very humiliating intellectual property dispute. She nervously tugged her hand down into her lap, desperately trying to hide my grandmother's stolen diamond ring, suddenly looking very small and entirely out of her depth. Before the silver-haired developer could demand an actual coherent explanation for the massive red warning banner, the heavy crystal chandeliers suspended above us began to slowly dim. A rich, deep voice echoed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, politely requesting that all esteemed guests direct their absolute attention to the main stage at the front of the room. The National Developers Gala was officially commencing. The timing was absolutely flawless. Terrell realized in that exact moment that he had a tiny, rapidly closing window to salvage his destroyed reputation. He knew that if he did not secure a very public, highly visible endorsement from the Caldwell Empire tonight, the rumors about his locked flash drive would spread through the ballroom like wildfire and permanently bankrupt his firm by tomorrow morning. I stood perfectly still in my borrowed black catering blazer, holding the silver serving tray against my hip. I watched Terrell abandon all pretense of professional courtesy and class. He grabbed Brittany's wrist with a harsh, aggressive grip, hauling her roughly out of her seat. He needed to be dead center at the absolute front of the stage. He needed to ensure he was the very first person my father saw when the spotlight hit the podium. Terrell physically pushed his way past the waitstaff, shoving his shoulder violently between a prominent state senator and a rival chief executive officer to force his way toward the front row. He dragged his terrified mistress behind him, completely ignoring the irritated murmurs and deeply offended glares from the powerful people he was shoving aside. His desperation was palpable. It radiated from his tailored suit like a foul, undeniable odor. I set my silver tray down on a nearby abandoned cocktail table. I reached up and unbuttoned the black catering blazer, slipping it off my shoulders and leaving it draped carelessly over the back of an empty chair. I did not need the disguise anymore. The shadows had served their purpose perfectly, allowing me to gather the exact, undeniable confirmation of his treacherous plans and spring my digital trap. Now it was time to step back into the blinding light. I adjusted the heavy, authentic emerald and diamond collar resting against my throat, ensuring the jewels sat perfectly against my collarbone. I smoothed my hands down the luxurious silk of my custom green couture gown. I moved quietly along the outer perimeter of the ballroom, positioning myself dead center in the wide main aisle. I stood just out of the immediate glare of the stage lights, completely shrouded in the ambient darkness of the room, but with a clear, unobstructed view of the front row. The massive velvet curtains at the back of the stage parted slowly. A single brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkened room, landing dead center on the polished mahogany podium. The ballroom erupted into deafening, thunderous applause before the man even reached the microphone. My father, Richard Caldwell, walked onto the stage. He moved with the slow, terrifying, deliberate grace of an apex predator who had already conquered every single territory he surveyed. He wore a sharp, immaculate midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His posture was completely rigid with generational authority, and his dark, intelligent eyes swept across the vast sea of industry titans with a calculating heavy weight. He did not smile. He did not offer a friendly wave to the crowd. He simply stepped up to the podium, placed his large hands on the polished wood, and waited for the applause to die down completely. He demanded absolute silence without uttering a single syllable, and the room eagerly obliged. When the massive ballroom was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. My father leaned into the microphone. His deep, resonant voice filled the cavernous space, commanding the absolute attention of every billionaire private investor and commercial developer in the building. He welcomed them to the gala, speaking briefly and powerfully about the long-storied legacy of the Caldwell Empire. He spoke about the uncompromising standards required to build the future of American real estate, especially as an African-American enterprise that had to fight twice as hard for every square foot of ground it claimed. He spoke about integrity, he spoke about vision, and then he seamlessly transitioned to the core focus of the evening. He announced that the Caldwell Investment Board was prepared to fully fund the most revolutionary urban development project the industry had seen in a decade. I watched Terrell standing at the very edge of the front row, hovering right near the base of the short, carpeted staircase leading up to the stage. He was practically vibrating out of his shoes with nervous, frenetic energy. He ran his sweaty palms down the front of his trousers over and over again, adjusting his bow tie, his eyes locked onto my father with a hungry, desperate devotion. Brittany stood slightly behind him, trying her best to look poised and important, but her pale eyes kept darting nervously around the room, acutely aware of the suspicious glares coming from the developers they had just abandoned at the VIP table. My father continued his powerful speech. He described the green architecture project in exquisite, intricate detail. He talked beautifully about the sustainable rooftop terraces, designed to reduce the urban heat index. He praised the culturally integrated community spaces, designed specifically to uplift and protect minority neighborhoods from aggressive corporate gentrification. He spoke passionately about the flawless structural engineering required to make such a grand vision financially viable without ever relying on external government subsidies. He was describing my exact blueprints. The very same blueprints Terrell had just tried and failed to open through his presentation tablet minutes ago. Terrell's chest puffed out so far, I thought the buttons on his crisp white shirt might actually pop off. He genuinely believed my father was talking directly about him. He believed the legendary Caldwell Empire was officially validating his architectural genius in front of the entire country. He looked back over his shoulder at the silver-haired developer he had been sitting with earlier. Terrell flashed a smug, deeply arrogant, triumphant smile, as if to boldly declare that the technical glitch with the flash drive did not matter anymore because the undisputed king of real estate was about to crown him personally. This brilliant, unprecedented architectural marvel was not designed by a massive corporate team or a faceless agency. My father announced, his voice echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system. It was conceptualized, meticulously drafted, and perfected by a single visionary mind. A mind that inherently understands that true architectural power comes from honoring the deep foundation of our communities, not exploiting them for a quick, thoughtless payout. The brilliant architect behind this magnificent blueprint is standing in this very room tonight, and it is my absolute greatest honor to invite the sole creator of this project to join me on this stage right now to receive the full, undivided financial backing of Caldwell Enterprises. That was the ultimate cue. Terrell did not even wait for his name to be called. His blind arrogance completely overrode his basic common sense and any shred of professional decorum. He was so entirely blinded by his own massive, fragile ego and his desperate, clawing need to secure the funding that he immediately stepped forward. He placed his polished leather shoe firmly onto the bottom step of the stage stairs. He reached up with both hands, smoothly buttoning his tuxedo jacket, fully preparing to strut up those steps and boldly accept the glory for my entire life's work. He looked back at Brittany one last time, giving her a quick, highly confident wink, fully ready to claim the ultimate victory. He was ready to walk up there, shake the hand of the most powerful man in real estate, and permanently seal his stolen legacy. My father stopped speaking mid-sentence. The booming resonance of his powerful voice cut out instantly, leaving a heavy, suffocating tension hanging in the dead quiet air of the massive ballroom. Richard Caldwell slowly turned his head to the right, looking directly down at the stairs. He saw Terrell standing there, his foot proudly resting on the first step, a bright, expectant, utterly pathetic smile plastered across his face. My father did not beckon him upward. He did not extend a welcoming hand to greet the young developer. Instead, Richard Caldwell physically turned his entire body and stepped directly toward the top of the stairs, completely and totally blocking the path. He loomed over Terrell like a dark, immovable mountain of righteous fury. The bright stage spotlight caught the absolute, unadulterated disgust twisting my father's sharp features. He looked down at the pathetic man who had abandoned his daughter in the freezing rain, the man who had brazenly stolen her grandmother's ring, drained her emergency money, and attempted to hijack her brilliant blueprints. The live microphone resting on the podium easily picked up the heavy, deadly silence stretching between them. Terrell's highly confident smile slowly began to falter the corners of his mouth, dropping as confusion set in. He froze completely, his foot still resting awkwardly on the bottom stair, staring up at the towering, furious figure of Richard Caldwell. Terrell looked incredibly lost, completely uncertain why the billionaire tycoon was currently glaring at him with a hatred so pure and intensely violent that it made the surrounding executives instinctively take a frightened step back. The trap was now fully set. The powerful audience was entirely captivated, and Terrell was standing exactly where I wanted him. The air in the grand ballroom grew so dense it felt difficult to breathe. Terrell remained frozen on the bottom step of the stage, his polished leather shoe anchored to the carpet, while his mind desperately tried to catch up with reality. He looked up at my father, his mouth slightly open, his hand still hovering near the button of his custom tuxedo jacket. I watched from the shadows at the back of the room, my heart beating with a steady, victorious rhythm. I could see the exact moment Terrell tried to salvage his crumbling dignity. He forced his trademark charming smile back onto his face, attempting to project the image of a confident, successful developer who was simply experiencing a minor miscommunication. He took a short, hesitant breath and leaned forward, likely preparing to introduce himself to the billionaire tycoon he thought he was about to partner with. My father did not give him the chance to speak a single word. Richard Caldwell turned his back on this pathetic man hovering on the stairs. He stepped squarely behind the polished mahogany podium and gripped the edges with both of his massive hands. The bright stage lights illuminated the fierce, unapologetic rage carved into his features. He leaned down into the microphone. The sheer proximity amplified the sound of his breathing, sending a low, dangerous static hum through the state-of-the-art speakers surrounding the ballroom. Every executive, every investor, and every prominent socialite in the room sat entirely paralyzed. They were waiting for the legendary real estate king to explain why he had just physically blocked the night's most anticipated architect from stepping onto the platform. My father raised his right hand high into the air. He brought his closed fist down onto the wooden podium with a violent, explosive force. The resounding crack echoed through the cavernous space like a gunshot. Several people in the front row physically jumped in their seats. Waiters stopped dead in their tracks, frozen with their silver trays suspended in the air. The sudden aggressive noise completely shattered the polite, refined atmosphere of the corporate gala. It was a raw, unfiltered display of absolute power. Richard Caldwell did not look at the crowd. He raised his hand again and pointed a single steady finger directly at the platinum VIP table dead center in the room. He pointed exactly at the chairs marked with the gold Caldwell family placard. The chairs where Terrell and Brittany had been sitting all evening, drinking our expensive champagne and parading around with my stolen designs. "Where is my daughter?" my father roared into the microphone. His deep, commanding voice bounced off the vaulted ceilings and struck the audience with the force of a physical blow. The absolute fury in his tone made the crystal centerpieces vibrate on the surrounding tables. Why is the sole heir to the Caldwell Empire not sitting in her rightful seat? He demanded, his voice growing louder, more ferocious with every single syllable. And who are these pathetic, arrogant parasites occupying it? The ballroom plunged into a profound, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when hundreds of powerful people collectively stop breathing. The words hung heavily in the air, echoing in the minds of everyone present. Sole heir, Caldwell Empire, pathetic parasites. The brutal, unmistakable accusations severed the tension in the room like a freshly sharpened blade. I stood motionless at the back of the main aisle, watching the absolute destruction of my husband's reality unfold in glorious cinematic slow motion. Terrell was still standing on the bottom step of the stage, but his forced smile had completely vanished. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His arms dropped limply to his sides. I could see his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The human brain is a fascinating mechanism. It tries to protect itself from catastrophic trauma by rejecting impossible information. Terrell's mind was desperately trying to calculate what was happening. He looked at the empty VIP table my father was pointing at. He looked at Brittany, who was currently cowering in her velvet chair, her face buried in her hands, desperately trying to hide from the blinding glare of the surrounding investors. Then the horrifying, undeniable realization finally hit him. He remembered the red warning banner that had flashed across the tablet screen just minutes ago. The banner that clearly stated the blueprints were the intellectual property of Maya Caldwell. He remembered my last name, the name I had quietly kept when we married, claiming it was simply to honor my late grandfather, the name he had always dismissed as common and unimportant. He remembered the bottomless, unexplained funds I had constantly funneled into his failing architecture firm over the past 10 years. He remembered my unbothered, terrifyingly calm smile when he demanded I go wait in the service kitchen like a member of the catering staff. His knees literally buckled. He stumbled backward off the bottom step, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the carpet. He reached out and grabbed the brass railing of the stairs just to keep himself from collapsing entirely onto the floor. His mouth opened and closed in a silent, desperate gasp. The self-proclaimed visionary, the arrogant man who had left me standing in the freezing New York sleet, was currently hyperventilating in front of the most powerful real estate developers in the country. I was completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and there was absolutely no escape. The chief lighting director, operating from the elevated audio-visual booth at the back of the ballroom, had been given very specific, very precise instructions by my father earlier that evening. Following the dramatic pointed accusation, the director hit a switch on the massive control board. The primary stage lights immediately dimmed, plunging my father and the front of the room into deep dramatic shadows. A single massive, brilliant white spotlight detached itself from the ceiling rig. The thick beam of light swung aggressively across the dark ballroom. It swept over the terrified, sweating face of my husband, highlighting his absolute panic for everyone to see. It moved past the platinum VIP table, exposing Brittany's cheap sequined dress and her trembling shoulders. It tracked steadily down the long, wide center aisle, passing over rows of bewildered, whispering executives who were craning their necks to see where the light was heading. The spotlight cut through the ambient darkness of the room with flawless precision. It bypassed the wealthy investors. It bypassed the prominent politicians. It landed directly in the very back of the room, stopping dead center on me. The blinding, brilliant illumination washed over my figure, pulling me completely out of the shadows. I stood perfectly straight, my posture radiating the undeniable generational authority of my bloodline. The entire ballroom collectively turned in their seats, hundreds of eyes following the beam of light to the back of the room. They saw a woman standing alone in the main aisle, draped in a plain, oversized black catering blazer. For a fraction of a second, the crowd was utterly confused. They were expecting to see a pampered, recognizable socialite. They were not expecting to see a member of the service staff. I could hear the confused murmurs rippling through the back tables, but I did not give them time to question my presence. I raised my hands slowly and deliberately. I grasped the lapels of the borrowed black jacket, With a fluid, graceful motion, I slipped the cheap fabric off my shoulders. I let the blazer drop carelessly from my fingers, allowing it to fall onto the carpeted floor behind me. The gasp that echoed through the grand ballroom was simultaneous and deafening. Stripped of the disguise, I stood fully revealed under the blinding spotlight. The custom couture gown caught the intense illumination, the heavy emerald silk glowing with a vibrant, commanding power. The dramatic plunging neckline and the sweeping train commanded instant, undeniable respect. But it was the heavy, authentic diamond and emerald collar resting against my throat that truly silenced the room. The priceless jewels glittered fiercely, casting fractured prisms of light across my dark skin. I did not look like a supportive, invisible wife. I did not look like a woman who could be pushed out of a luxury sedan into a frozen puddle. I looked exactly like the sole billionaire heiress to the most powerful real estate dynasty on the West Coast. I locked my eyes onto Terrell. He was standing hundreds of feet away at the front of the room, clutching the brass railing of the stage stairs, as if his life depended on it. Even from this distance, I could see the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from his body. The man who had spent 10 years making me feel incredibly small was currently shrinking under the weight of my absolute glory. I offered him a slow, cold, devastating smile. The final, spectacular act of his ruin had officially begun, and I was ready to take center stage. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and heavy. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a devastating storm. Every single eye in that cavernous space followed the blinding beam of the spotlight as it rested entirely on me. I stood at the very back of the center aisle, letting the sheer weight of the moment settle over the crowd. I took my first step forward. The heavy emerald silk of my custom couture gown whispered against the plush carpet, a soft but commanding sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my head held high, radiating the undeniable generational authority of my bloodline. The authentic diamond and emerald collar around my neck caught the intense glare of the stage lights, casting sharp, blinding prisms across the room. As I moved slowly down the long center aisle, the sea of industry titans, billionaire investors, and powerful politicians physically parted for me. Men who had spent their entire lives commanding boardrooms instinctively stepped back, pulling their chairs out of my way. They did not know my face, but they instantly recognized the raw, terrifying power I carried. I kept my gaze locked dead ahead. I was not looking at the audience. I was looking directly at the man standing at the base of the stage stairs. Terrell was completely paralyzed. His hands gripped the polished brass railing so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. The smug, arrogant developer who had paraded around the red carpet less than an hour ago was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, hyperventilating fraud. I watched the horrific realization crash over his features in real time. His eyes darted frantically from my face to the heavy emeralds at my throat, down to the sweeping train of my gown, and then up to the stage where my father stood glaring down at him. The mental calculation was destroying him. The plain, boring, supportive wife he had left shivering on the freezing New York pavement was the sole billionaire heiress he had spent months desperately trying to exploit. The woman whose skin tone and natural hair he claimed were not polished enough for his elite social circles was currently commanding a room full of the most powerful people in the country without uttering a single syllable. I took another measured step forward, the rhythmic click of my stilettos acting as a countdown to his ruin. Terrell's knees physically gave out. He stumbled heavily against the brass railing, his legs unable to support the crushing weight of his own profound stupidity. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to form a word, a plea, an excuse, but his throat was completely dry. He was choking on his own unadulterated panic. Over at the Platinum VIP table, the situation was equally catastrophic. Brittany sat frozen in her velvet chair, the harsh spotlight illuminating her cheap sequined dress for the entire ballroom to see. The smug, victorious mistress who had laughed while intentionally throwing red wine on my coat was now trembling uncontrollably. She looked down at her left hand, staring in absolute horror at the heavy vintage diamond resting on her ring finger. The realization that she was wearing stolen property belonging to the Caldwell dynasty hit her like a physical blow. Panic completely overrode her desire to sit at the center table. She abruptly pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. She kept her head down, clutching her small purse against her chest, and tried to scurry away toward the darkened side exit of the ballroom. She did not make it more than 10 feet before the head of Caldwell Security stepped into her path. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "your gala credentials have been revoked. You may leave the property through the escorted exit or remain here until law enforcement completes its business." Brittany looked toward the side corridor, then back toward Terrell. For reasons I could not understand, she stayed. Perhaps shock had frozen her in place. Perhaps she still believed Terrell could somehow save them both. The destruction was not contained strictly to the main ballroom. Out in the grand foyer, massive high-definition venue monitors were broadcasting the gala live to the overflow guests and VIP entourages holding in the lobby. Standing right in front of the largest screen, sipping expensive champagne they had not paid for, were Terrell's sister Chloe and her aggressively racist husband Julian. They had been eagerly waiting to watch Terrell accept his funding so they could immediately leech off his new billionaire status. Instead, they were watching the live feed of the ballroom. They watched my father slam his fist onto the podium and demand to know why his daughter was missing. They watched the spotlight swing across the room. And then they watched the camera zoom in directly on my face. Julian dropped his crystal champagne flute. The delicate glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces against the polished marble floor, splashing expensive alcohol across his tailored leather shoes. He stood there, completely petrified, staring up at the screen. The woman filling the massive display, the glittering, untouchable billionaire heiress, currently parting a sea of industry executives, was the exact same woman he had just called a homeless stalker and a ghetto charity case. He had laughed at me. He had commanded airport security to throw me out into the cold. He had loudly mocked my clothing and my skin. Chloe grabbed her husband's arm, her sharp fingernails digging frantically into his suit jacket. She stared at the monitor, her mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated horror. She realized in that exact second that the designer handbag she was currently clutching, the luxury car she drove, and the expensive home she lived in were all funded by the woman she had spent 5 years relentlessly abusing. They had built their entire arrogant, entitled existence on my hidden bank accounts, and they had just publicly insulted the owner of the hotel they were currently standing inside. As Julian tried to pull Chloe backward, desperately attempting to flee the lobby before the situation escalated, the chief of gala security calmly stepped up behind them. The security chief did not offer a polite smile. He signaled for 4 hotel guards to immediately flank the terrified couple, trapping them against the velvet ropes. He informed them that their perimeter clearance was officially revoked. Their gala credentials were revoked immediately. Security informed them that they could leave the hotel through a private service exit or remain in the holding area away from the ballroom. Neither of them moved. They simply stared at the live screen as the reality of what they had done continued to unfold. Back inside the grand ballroom, I finally reached the very front of the center aisle. The space between the platinum VIP table and the stage felt highly charged, crackling with lethal electric tension. I stopped directly in front of Terrell. He was still clutching the brass railing, sweat beading rapidly along his forehead and dripping down his neck, completely ruining his crisp white collar. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading, begging for a single ounce of the endless mercy I had shown him over the past decade. "Maya," he choked out his voice, a pathetic broken whisper that barely carried over the silence of the room. "Please, I did not know. Please, you have to listen to me." I did not offer him a smile. I did not show him a single fraction of an emotion. I looked down at him with the exact same cold, dismissive contempt he had shown me on the airport sidewalk. I simply stepped past him, leaving him gasping for air at the bottom of the stairs. I placed my hand delicately onto the brass railing and glided gracefully up the short carpeted staircase. The heavy emerald silk of my train dragged slowly across the steps, a beautiful, devastating display of absolute power. I reached the top of the stage and walked directly over to the polished mahogany podium. My father stepped to the side, his dark eyes shining with an overwhelming, profound pride. He did not say a word. He simply reached out and gently removed the microphone from its heavy metal stand, offering it to me. I took the microphone, my fingers cool and steady against the smooth black surface. I turned to face the massive audience, looking out over the sea of faces that were entirely captivated by the spectacular drama unfolding before them. Then I looked down. I looked directly down at Terrell, who was now staring up at me from the floor, his entire body trembling violently under the crushing weight of his impending doom. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see exactly how the Caldwell heiress would execute the man who had stolen her seat. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, completely calm, smoothly polished, and laced with absolute terrifying authority. "Terrell," I said, letting his name hang heavily in the cold, quiet air. "I want to sincerely thank you for keeping my seat warm tonight. You did a spectacular job holding my place while I was busy running my empire. But your shift is officially over." Terrell let out a quiet, devastated sob, his hands covering his face as the sheer magnitude of his public destruction finally crushed him. I did not break eye contact with his pathetic, crumbling figure. I simply raised my free hand in the air and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the audio-visual team waiting anxiously in the production booth at the back of the room. The time for talking was completely finished. It was time to show the entire world the undeniable, legally binding truth. I watched the massive digital projection screens behind me flicker to life, ready to expose every single corporate secret, every stolen dollar, and every fraudulent document my husband had ever created. The true annihilation of his stolen legacy had finally arrived. The massive digital projection screens behind me illuminated the grand ballroom with a blinding white glow. The soft ambient lighting of the gala was entirely obliterated by the stark, undeniable reality of high-resolution legal documents flashing across the displays. I did not need to look back at the screens. I knew every single syllable, every signature, and every corporate seal by heart. The first documents to appear were the Certificate of Incorporation for Apex Holdings, followed by its shareholder and board records. My name, Maya Caldwell, was listed in bold black ink as the sole shareholder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. Directly beside it, the screens populated the operating agreement for Terrell's architectural firm. The paperwork clearly outlined that his highly praised company was nothing more than a subsidiary branch majority owned and controlled by my corporation. The visual evidence was completely irrefutable. A low collective murmur rippled through the hundreds of elite developers and billionaire investors sitting at their tables. The men who had just spent the entire evening listening to Terrell boast about his self-made empire were now reading the precise legal text that proved he was nothing more than a glorified expendable employee. I looked down at Terrell. He was still clinging to the brass railing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the screens with wide, bloodshot eyes. His lips moved silently as he read the contracts, his mind completely failing to grasp how a decade of his arrogant independence was actually a meticulously constructed cage I had built and financed. I brought the microphone back to my lips. My voice was completely steady, cutting through the murmurs of the stunned crowd like a sharpened blade. "Terrell," I announced, ensuring every single person in the ballroom heard the finality in my tone. "As the controlling shareholder acting through Apex Holdings and pursuant to the board resolution displayed behind me, I am officially terminating your employment as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." Terrell let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, but I did not give him a fraction of a second to interrupt me. I took a slow, commanding step toward the edge of the stage, looking down at him with pure, unadulterated contempt. I wanted the entire industry to know exactly why he was being destroyed. I continued, speaking, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are being terminated for gross misconduct, severe breach of fiduciary duty, and the blatant, unapologetic theft of my intellectual property. The green architecture blueprints you brought to this gala tonight were conceptualized, drafted, and finalized entirely by me. You bypassed my secure servers, stole my life's work, and attempted to sell my cultural vision to my own father just to fund your pathetic, deceitful lifestyle." The second slide transitioned on the massive screens behind me. This time it displayed a highly detailed, itemized financial ledger. It was the joint corporate bank account Terrell had been draining. The crowd gasped loudly as the screen highlighted his most recent transactions. "You did not just steal my blueprints," I continued, my voice echoing through the silent, captivated room. You embezzled our emergency operational capital to finance a $50,000 diamond necklace for your secretary. You used Caldwell money to book luxury suites, charter private flights, and purchase designer clothing for your sister Chloe, while telling your staff that budgets were too tight for their annual bonuses. Yao built an entire illusion of wealth using my hidden funds, and tonight the bank is permanently closed. The absolute finality of my words physically broke him. Terrell's knees buckled completely. He collapsed onto the carpeted floor at the base of the stage, falling heavily onto his hands and knees in front of the most powerful people in the country. The arrogant, untouchable man, who had deliberately left me soaking wet and freezing on a New York sidewalk, was now crawling on the floor, weeping openly in his custom tuxedo. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his pride. "Maya, please," Terrell sobbed, his voice cracking horribly over the microphone feedback. "I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was stupid. Please, you cannot do this to me. You are my wife. We built a life together. You love me. You know I would never have done this if I was thinking clearly. I was manipulated. I was stressed. Please, Maya, forgive me." I stared down at him with a cold, hollow emptiness. He was not apologizing because he regretted hurting me. He was apologizing because he had finally been caught, and the consequences of his actions were actively destroying his future. When begging me yielded absolutely no sympathy, his desperate, panicked mind desperately searched for a scapegoat. He needed someone else to blame for his catastrophic failure. He slowly turned his head, his tear-filled eyes locking onto Brittany, who was still trapped by the wall of Caldwell security guards near the side exit. Terrell pointed a shaking finger directly at his mistress. "It was her!" Terrell screamed, his voice echoing frantically across the ballroom. "She manipulated me. She seduced me and poisoned my mind against you, Maya. Brittany told me to take the blueprints. She told me to claim them as her own, so she could get a promotion. She forced me to buy that diamond ring. She threatened to ruin my reputation if I did not bring her to this gala. I never wanted her. It was all her fault." The sheer, cowardly betrayal of his words hung heavily in the air. He was perfectly willing to throw the woman he had just publicly called his fiancée directly under the bus, the absolute second his own survival was threatened. Brittany stood frozen near the exit, her pale face turning a bright, violent shade of crimson. The sheer humiliation of being publicly discarded and blamed for his crimes completely snapped her fragile composure. The terrified, cowering mistress instantly transformed into a vicious, cornered animal. Brittany pushed violently away from the security guards, ignoring their towering presence. She marched furiously through the tables, her cheap sequined dress catching the stage lights. She stomped directly toward the center aisle where Terrell was still kneeling on the floor. She snatched a full, heavy goblet of red wine off a nearby abandoned table as she moved. "You pathetic, lying coward!" Brittany shrieked at the top of her lungs, her high-pitched voice echoing without the need for a microphone. "You promised me you were going to divorce her. You told me you were a multimillionaire and that your wife was just a miserable broke loser holding you back. You swore you designed those buildings yourself." She reached Terrell just as he attempted to stand up to silence her. Brittany did not hesitate. She pulled her arm back and threw the entire goblet of dark red wine directly into his face. The deep crimson liquid splashed violently across his eyes, soaking his white shirt and ruining his custom tuxedo jacket. Terrell gasped, stumbling backward and wiping frantically at his eyes, but Brittany was not finished. Her rage had completely blinded her to the consequences of her next words. "You want to blame me?" Brittany screamed. "You were the one who told me to move money between those accounts. You were the one who sent me the invoices and told me never to ask questions. You said the transfers were legal. You said Apex would never notice." Terrell went completely still. Brittany pointed at him with a shaking hand. "Do not stand there and pretend I invented any of this. I still have every email you sent me." A collective horrified gasp erupted from the tables of developers and investors. Brittany's outburst did not prove every suspected offense by itself, but it publicly confirmed something far more important. The suspicious transfers were real. The questionable invoices were real, and Terrell had personally instructed her to participate. Most importantly, she claimed to possess the emails documenting those instructions. I could almost feel the federal case tightening around him. Terrell lunged forward, trying to cover her mouth, but two Caldwell security guards instantly intercepted him, grabbing his arms and pinning him effortlessly to the floor. I stood at the podium, watching the magnificent chaotic destruction unfold exactly as I had planned. They were destroying each other, tearing each other to shreds in a desperate, ugly bid for survival. I looked away from the pathetic display on the floor and glanced down at the blinding diamond watch resting on my wrist. The delicate gold hands aligned perfectly. It was exactly midnight. I raised my eyes to the back of the ballroom, looking directly at the administrative check-in desks near the grand entrance. I caught the eye of the frantic press coordinator who was standing by the heavy oak doors. She had been watching the stage intently, waiting for my command. I gave her a single sharp nod. The coordinator immediately sprang into action. She signaled her junior staff, and within seconds, the sealed manila envelopes I had provided earlier were rapidly distributed to every single major financial journalist seated in the ballroom. The reporters who had been aggressively typing notes on their phones throughout the entire spectacle eagerly ripped open the thick folders. I watched their faces transition from sheer shock to absolute predatory excitement as they read the documents inside. The envelopes contained a carefully prepared public evidence packet, corporate ownership records, the documented intellectual property trail, and copies of the financial discrepancies that had already been disclosed to federal investigators. The journalists immediately began snapping photos of the documents, the loud, continuous clicks of their cameras adding a frantic driving rhythm to the chaos in the room. Terrell, still pinned to the carpet by my father's security team, looked back at the journalists in complete, unadulterated horror. He knew exactly what those envelopes contained. He knew that by tomorrow morning his face and his crimes would be plastered across the front page of every single business publication in the world. Howe was ruined. As the journalists scrambled to file their breaking stories, the massive heavy oak doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung open with a loud, definitive thud. The ambient noise in the room instantly died down as a group of stern, uniformed Las Vegas police officers marched into the venue. They were accompanied by two plainclothes federal agents wearing distinct tactical badges on their belts. They moved with absolute purpose down the center aisle, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts, ignoring the staring billionaires and wealthy socialites. The authorities did not stop to ask questions. The federal agents were acting on warrants approved through the investigation that had been developing for months. The lead federal agent approached the front of the stage, looking down at Terrell, who was weeping uncontrollably on the wine-stained carpet. The agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, the metallic clink echoing sharply in the quiet ballroom. The ultimate, inescapable consequences of my husband's arrogance had finally arrived to collect their debt. The federal agent stopped directly in front of Terrell and pulled a folded document from the inside pocket of his jacket. He identified himself clearly, then stated Terrell's full legal name in a voice that carried across the silent ballroom. Terrell Caldwell, you are under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant issued in connection with an ongoing financial investigation. Terrell stared at him as if the words belonged to another language. No, he whispered. The agent told him to stand and place his hands behind his back. For the first time that entire night, Terrell obeyed without arguing. The two Caldwell security guards released his arms and stepped away, immediately surrendering control of the situation to law enforcement. Terrell pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. His tuxedo was soaked with red wine, his white shirt was wrinkled, and the confidence he had worn like armor for 10 years was completely gone. The agent secured one wrist, then the other. The sharp click of the handcuffs was quieter than my father's fist hitting the podium, quieter than Brittany's wineglass striking Terrell's chest, quieter than the gasp that had swept through the ballroom when my identity was revealed. But somehow it was the sound that ended everything. Terrell looked up at me. Maya. I said nothing. His face collapsed. Maya, please, you can fix this. The words almost made me laugh, but there was nothing funny left. For 10 years I had fixed everything. I fixed payroll when he overspent. I fixed contracts he nearly lost. I fixed client relationships he damaged with his arrogance. I fixed his reputation, his company, his cash flow, and his endless mistakes, while he convinced himself that my silence meant dependence. Even now, standing in handcuffs in front of federal agents, he still believed my purpose was to rescue him. I lowered the microphone. I spent 10 years fixing your mistakes, Terrell. His eyes filled with desperate hope for one irrational second. Then I finished. That part of my life is over. The hope disappeared. The agents began guiding him toward the center aisle. He twisted once, looking back at me over his shoulder. Maya, I love you. I finally smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No, Terrell. You loved what I did for you. He had no answer. The agents led him through the ballroom while hundreds of people watched in absolute silence. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. The moment did not need celebration. The destruction was complete enough on its own. As Terrell disappeared through the heavy doors, Brittany stood near the side exit with both hands pressed against her mouth. One of the federal agents approached her next. Ms. Hayes, he said calmly, we need to speak with you regarding the records and emails you just referenced. Brittany's eyes darted toward the door where Terrell had vanished. Am I under arrest? Arrest not at this moment, the agent replied. But you are not to destroy, alter, or conceal any device, account, or record relevant to this investigation. Do you understand? She nodded quickly. Then her gaze dropped to her own left hand. My grandmother's ring still glittered beneath the ballroom lights. Her expression changed. For the first time that evening, she looked ashamed. She slowly pulled the vintage diamond from her finger. I did not move toward her. I did not want to touch it until the investigators had documented exactly where it had been found. Brittany held it out with a trembling hand. He told me it belonged to his family, she whispered. I looked at the ring, then at her. He lied to both of us. That was the only mercy I gave her. The federal agent took possession of the ring, photographed it, and placed it carefully into an evidence envelope. I did the same with the expensive necklace around Brittany's throat after confirming that the purchase appeared in the corporate records. The necklace represented money. The ring represented something money could never replace. I watched the agent seal the envelope and felt the first real crack in the anger that had carried me through the night. My grandmother had worn that ring for 42 years. My mother had placed it in my hand before she died. Terrell had treated it like a prop. He could steal the object. He could never steal what it meant. Brittany handed the agent her phone and promised to provide access to the email account she had referenced. She was escorted from the ballroom through a private corridor to speak with investigators away from the press. Only then did I realize the gala had gone completely silent again. Hundreds of employees, investors, developers, and journalists were still staring at me. My father stepped beside me. What do you want to do now? He asked quietly. I looked out at the ballroom. Part of me wanted to say end it. Turn off the lights. Empty the room. Close Terrell's firm by sunrise and let every piece of his manufactured empire collapse with him. Then I thought about the junior architects I had watched working late in that office. The project managers who stayed through weekends because Terrell promised bonuses he never paid. The administrative assistants who had nothing to do with his fraud. The young designers whose careers would be destroyed if investors assumed the entire company was corrupt. Terrell had spent years treating people as disposable. I refused to become him simply because I finally had the power to do it. I lifted the microphone again. There is one more thing everyone in this room needs to understand. The audience went still. Terrell has been removed as chief executive officer. That does not mean the architects, engineers, assistants, and project managers employed by the firm are losing their jobs tonight. A visible ripple moved across the room. Several people near the back were employees of the company. I recognized their faces. They looked terrified. Apex Holdings will maintain payroll. I continued. An independent forensic team will review the company's finances. A temporary executive team will assume operations immediately. Any employee who acted lawfully and in good faith will be protected. My father's expression softened beside me. I looked directly toward the employees. You will not pay for crimes you did not commit. One woman covered her mouth and began to cry. That reaction affected me more than Terrell begging on the floor ever could. Power was easy when it was used to punish someone. The harder test was deciding who deserved protection. I turned slightly toward my father. Richard Caldwell understood what I wanted before I had to ask. He stepped back to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this gala was created to fund architecture capable of changing communities for the better. That purpose has not changed simply because the wrong man attempted to claim the work." The massive screens behind us changed again. The financial ledgers disappeared. In their place appeared the first clean rendering of my green housing project. No red warning, no Terrell logo, no Brittany name, just the design. My design. Across the bottom of the screen appeared a simple title: The Caldwell Community Renewal Initiative, created by Maya Caldwell. My throat tightened. For 2 years I had worked on those plans alone after midnight, never imagining what it would feel like to see my own name attached to them in a room filled with the most powerful developers in the country. My father continued, "Caldwell Enterprises will fund the project. Apex Holdings will oversee the design and development structure, and the architect whose name belongs on this work will lead it." He turned toward me. "My daughter." The applause started slowly. Then it spread. I did not need it. That surprised me most. 10 years earlier, I would have imagined that public recognition would feel like revenge. I thought I would want every person in the ballroom standing, every camera pointed at me, every investor knowing Terrell had been a fraud, and I had been the mind behind everything. But when the applause rose around me, what I felt was quieter. Relief. My work had my name again. That was enough. 3 weeks later, my life looked almost nothing like it had before the gala. The divorce petition was filed the first business day after I returned to New York. Terrell attempted to contact me repeatedly through mutual acquaintances, old employees, and eventually his attorneys. I blocked every personal route and instructed my legal team to handle anything that actually required a response. The criminal case was still moving through the federal system. I did not pretend to know how it would end. Investigators continued reviewing financial records, vendor accounts, and the emails Brittany had preserved. Terrell had attorneys of his own and every right to defend himself. For the first time in our marriage, his consequences were no longer my responsibility. Apex formally removed him from every management position. His 35% equity interest did not magically disappear simply because I hated him. It remained subject to the corporate agreements, the forensic review, and whatever legal claims followed from the investigation. I had spent too many years watching Terrell bend reality to suit himself. I had no intention of doing the same thing simply because I held the controlling vote. The company itself survived. We appointed an interim chief executive with no personal connection to my family. Payroll continued. The forensic team separated legitimate projects from questionable transactions. Several junior employees who had been preparing to resign chose to stay once they realized Terrell would not be returning. I stopped hiding from them. For the first time, I walked through the headquarters building as Maya Caldwell, chairwoman of Apex Holdings and majority owner of the company. The building had always belonged to my private holding company. Now everyone knew who the landlord was. Chloe and Julian disappeared from my life almost as quickly as Terrell did. Once the company cards were canceled and the unauthorized personal expenses were identified, the designer purchases, luxury travel, and constant stream of financial favors stopped. Chloe sent me one message. It said she was sorry for everything and hoped we could someday be family again. I read it once. Then I deleted it. Forgiveness, I had finally learned, did not require renewed access. Brittany cooperated with investigators. I did not suddenly consider her innocent. She had humiliated me, lied about my work, and willingly participated in Terrell's deception. But she also handed over the emails she claimed to possess. A week after the gala, my grandmother's ring was formally returned to me after investigators completed the documentation they needed. I sat alone in my New York apartment, with the small evidence envelope resting in my hands. When I opened it, the diamond looked exactly the way I remembered. I cleaned it carefully and placed it back inside the old velvet box. I did not wear it. Not yet. Some things need time before they stop carrying the memory of how they were taken. The green housing project moved forward faster than I expected. Caldwell Enterprises approved the first development site, and Apex created a separate project company so the architecture financing and community commitments could be independently audited. I insisted on one condition before approving a single construction contract. Residents from the neighborhoods affected by the development would have permanent seats on the Community Advisory Board. If the project was supposed to protect people from displacement, then the people living there deserved a voice stronger than a marketing brochure. My father agreed immediately. A month after the gala, he and I stood together on the roof of the first property scheduled for redevelopment. It was a cold morning in New York, but the sky was clear. Below us, traffic moved through the city in endless streams. Construction crews were beginning survey work on the neighboring block. My father rested both hands on the railing. "You know," he said, "I spent years trying to respect your decision not to use the Caldwell name publicly." I looked at him. "That sounds like there is a but coming. There is always a but." I laughed. He grew serious. "I understand why you wanted to know whether someone could love you without the money. What I never understood was why you believed you had to hide everything else too." I did not answer immediately, because he was right. I had told myself for 10 years that I was conducting some noble experiment. If Terrell did not know about the fortune, then his love would be pure. If I dressed plainly, stayed quiet, and let him lead, then I would know he wanted Maya rather than Caldwell Enterprises. But somewhere along the way, I stopped hiding only the money. I hid my ambition. I hid my talent. I hid my authority. I allowed my own architectural work to sit behind his name because correcting the record might make him feel insecure. I let him call me unsophisticated because defending myself would reveal too much. I let him believe I needed him because I was terrified that if he discovered I did not, he might leave. And in the end, he left anyway. Not because I was too powerful, because he never respected the woman standing beside him. I looked out across the city. I thought hiding the fortune would show me whether he loved the real me, I said. My father waited. But I was not showing him the real me. Richard nodded slowly. Exactly. The truth hit harder than anything Terrell had said on that freezing sidewalk. I had spent a decade blaming him for making me small. He deserved that blame. But I had also participated in my own disappearance. I had mistaken silence for humility. I had mistaken sacrifice for love. I had mistaken being needed for being valued. The lesson was not that I should have revealed my bank accounts on our first date. It was not that wealthy women should test everyone around them or hide behind secret corporations. The lesson was much simpler. Anyone who requires you to become less intelligent, less ambitious, less visible, or less yourself in order to keep loving you does not love you. They love the version of you that makes them comfortable. My father reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "So what happens now?" I smiled. "Now I build." Below us, a survey crew unrolled the first set of site plans. My name was printed in the title block. Maya Caldwell. Not hidden inside a shell company. Not buried beneath Terrell's logo. Not erased to protect a fragile ego. Mine. I had spent 10 years shrinking so someone else could feel tall. I would never make myself smaller for anyone again. And for the first time in 10 years, I walked into my own future at my full height. The biggest lesson from Maya's story is that love should never require you to shrink yourself. For years, she hid her intelligence, ambition, wealth, and talent to protect Terrell's ego and prove that he loved her for who she was. Instead, he became entitled, disrespectful, and willing to steal from the very woman who built his success. Maya finally learned that real love does not demand silent sacrifice or self-erasure. The right people will respect your strength instead of feeling threatened by it. Protect your identity, your work, and your boundaries, because anyone who needs you smaller does not deserve access to your life. Like, comment, and subscribe if you believe you should never make yourself smaller just to make someone else feel bigger.